Hello everyone, this is Mr. Millette with an AP European History presentation. Today's presentation is all about the French Revolution. Arguably, the French Revolution was the most significant event in European history prior to World War I. It had far-reaching consequences on the French people and people outside of France and even outside of Europe. It, more than any 18th century conflict, challenged Europe's balance of power, its political and social traditions, and its views on European subjects. This presentation will focus on the historical situations that were established leading up to the outbreak of the French Revolution. Additionally, this presentation will address the long and short-term causes of the French Revolution. You will learn about the various events and characteristics of the ever-changing revolutionary activity throughout the entirety of the French Revolutionary period. And lastly, you will learn about the revolution's outcomes and its consequences. At the end of this presentation, you'll be expected to be able to demonstrate your understanding of these 7 learning objectives. 1. Explain the causes and consequences of European maritime competition from 1648 to 1815. 2. Explain the economic and political consequences of the rivalry between Britain and France from 1648 to 1815. 3. Explain the causes, events, and consequences of the French Revolution. 4. Explain how the events and developments of the French Revolution influenced political and social ideas from 1648 to 1815. 5. Explain the effects of Napoleon's rule on European social, economic, and political life. 6. Explain the nationalist responses to Napoleon's rule in Europe. And 7. Explain how states responded to Napoleonic rule in Europe and the consequences of the response. Europe's political landscape was quite an anomaly. While other parts of the world had tightly centralized governments that governed unified land-based regional empires, like the Ming and Qing dynasties of China and the Ottoman Empire of Southwest Asia, European states were smaller in terms of their physical size within Europe and existed in a political landscape that had dozens of independent European nation-states. Europe as a whole did not belong to a single empire, but the individual European nation-states built vast maritime empires in their colonies in the Western Hemisphere and their trade posts in the Eastern Hemisphere. The most prominent of the European maritime empires had been the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, the French, and the English. Among those globalizing powers, economic and militant rivalry was created and intensified throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. The expansion of European commerce accelerated the growth of a worldwide economic network, as Europeans came to dominate the commercial activity in the Atlantic, Indian, and Pacific Oceans. The Portuguese and the Spanish empires truly did lead the way in colonial and trade post expansion in the late 15th and 16th centuries. Eventually, in the 17th century, the Dutch Empire entered the global scene and challenged the Spanish and the Portuguese in the Eastern Hemisphere. Not long after that, the French and the English empires would be established, and the fight for which nation would be most dominant in and out of Europe in the 18th century was on. In Asia, these rivalries culminated in British domination in India and Dutch control of the East Indies. In Europe, one could argue that it was France that was the most powerful state at the beginning of the 18th century, but as conflicts intensified, France's status and favorable balance of power would be challenged. In the Americas, England, France, and Spain had the largest colonial empires, but that too would be challenged with the increased conflict that characterized the second half of the 18th century. In the first half of the 18th century, France had been able to retain its militant dominance within Europe after the War of the Spanish Succession and the War of the Austrian Succession. In fact, France enjoyed a bit of a favorable balance of power by the midpoint of the 18th century. However, European rivalries did not cool off, and in the second half of the 18th century, The rivalry that intensified the most in and out of Europe was the rivalry between France and England. The rivalry between France and England resulted in world wars, fought both in Europe and in the colonies, and ultimately resulting in England supplanting France as the greatest European power. The first major conflict in the second half of the 18th century between these two nations was the 7 Years' War between 1756 and 1763. Coming off of the War of the Austrian Succession, which ended in 1748, a sort of diplomatic revolution had occurred with the outbreak of the 7 Years' War. When the 7 Years' War broke out, longtime rivals, the Austrian Habsburgs and the French Bourbons, actually aligned with each other in order to stop Prussia and England from becoming too powerful. Prussia was a force to be reckoned with within Central Europe, as far as France and Austria were concerned. England was a force to be reckoned with outside of Europe, as far as France was concerned. So in a multi-front war that included battles in Europe, North America, the Caribbean, India, and the Philippines, France and England waged an expensive global conflict against each other for their imperial pursuits. With the treaties of 1763, and most importantly the Treaty of Paris of 1763, France surrendered its holds in India to England, which gave England and the British East India Company an immense amount of authority in South Asia. Additionally, France surrendered enormous amounts of territory in North America to England. England also received Florida from Spain, who had aligned with France during the 7 Years' War, ending the first Spanish period in Florida. However, France was indebted to Spain because of that alliance and ceded the Louisiana Territory to Spain. France, by 1763, was a shell of its once powerful global dominion, while England established its global hegemony. England's establishment of its global dominance did not occur without challenges. As much as France had found itself in debt to its allies from the 7 Years' War, England did too. While France's absolute monarchy merely raised taxes on the French peasantry and relinquished land to Spain, England would raise taxes on its American colonists. Abandoning its tradition of salutary neglect, England invoked a more restrictive mercantilist relationship with its North American colonies. The political and economic transition in England's maintenance of its global empire resulted in the outbreak of the American Revolution. Having been denied representation in England's parliament, and having experienced increased taxes, British military presence, and acts that challenged American colonists' natural rights to life, liberty, and property, American colonial statesmen drafted the Declaration of Independence, and the American Revolution was underway. It would not be long before the French military sided with the American colonists against the British Empire in the American Revolution. American colonists were fighting for independence, natural rights, and representative government, all ideas from the Enlightenment. France, as you know, was a prominent location for Enlightenment idealism in the early to mid-18th century. The French populace and even the French bourgeoisie tended to favor the American colonial war effort, as it embodied the spirit of the French Enlightenment. However, France's government was characterized by a divine right absolutist Bourbon monarch named Louis XVI. Louis XVI, much like his absolutist predecessors, was not in favor of Enlightenment idealism becoming a French reality, as that would result in his loss of power. Yet Louis aligned with the American colonists, aided them financially, and sent French troops to fight side by side with them in a conflict characterized by Enlightenment idealism. How's that for irony? An absolutist supporting an Enlightenment-motivated conflict. Well, that isn't exactly why Louis did what he did, as he was more interested in defeating England and reestablishing France as the dominant European nation, another case of the balance of power dictating Europe's military alliances. With English surrender at Yorktown in 1781 and the Treaty of Paris of 1783 finalizing England's removal from the 13 colonies, The American nation was formed. England also relinquished Florida back to Spain, sparking the beginning of the Second Spanish period. Unfortunately for France, its wartime debt as an ally to the American colonies would far outweigh its land acquisitions from having been on the winning side of the war, and Louis would once again demand the French peasantry and its tax contribution to help offset his nation's debt. It is within this backdrop that France was heading toward its own drastic political, social, and cultural transformations. First, the long-held tradition of absolutism and divine right authority weighed heavily on the backs of French peasants and the French bourgeoisie. The peasantry, void of privilege and protection of rights, had virtually no recourse in improving their conditions except through revolt. The bourgeoisie, a budding French middle class, which was urban in nature and prosperous when compared to the plight of the French peasantry, was still victimized by French absolutism and mercantilism. The French middle class was not the same as the French nobility. The nobility had a tradition of enjoying political and social privilege, as they held political titles and enormous estates. They were as involved in French absolutism as the monarch deemed them necessary, and typically, since the age of absolutism, enjoyed a closeness to the Bourbon monarchs at Versailles. Beyond that, the French clergy also enjoyed a higher political and social status within the French traditional system. Referred to as the ancient regime, the French absolutist state was characterized by three social classes, known as the estate system. The first estate was the most privileged and was comprised of the royal family and the most prominent members of the French Roman Catholic clergy. The second estate was also of the privileged order and was comprised of the French nobility. The largest estate was the third estate, and it was void of privilege and protection and was comprised of the French bourgeoisie, the French urban working class, and the French rural peasantry. Although there was a body politic in France called the Estates General, the Estates General had not convened since the early 17th century, which signified the lack of agency that underprivileged peoples had in the French political system. This archaic system came under great scrutiny and criticism by the French philosophes earlier in the 18th century during the Age of Enlightenment. Voltaire and Montesquieu presented a corrupted absolute monarchy that was reinforced by a corrupted religious institution. Rousseau redefined Frenchmen as active political agents and citizens rather than subjects who merely accepted and imposed an unchangeable political system. The physiocrats challenged the practice of French mercantilism and deemed it financially harmful on the French bourgeoisie. And what was probably most unsettling was the fact that French soldiers served alongside American colonial soldiers in an Enlightenment-motivated independence movement, only to return home to France and live in a place that was anything but a political system born out of Enlightenment idealism. The French Revolution resulted from a combination of long-term social and political causes and was exacerbated by short-term fiscal and economic crises. 1789 was a difficult year for French society. In addition to the long-held abuses of the underprivileged and underrepresented French Third Estate, was a looming economic crisis. French agricultural production had been reduced by 2 consecutive harsh winters and poor harvests. This created a shortage of staple crops in French households. Most importantly, it created a shortage of bread in French markets, including the Parisian markets. That bread shortage created a drastic increase in the price of bread, so much so that it priced itself out of the households of many of the French urban populations. French mercantilism did not prevent nor fix the economic crisis, and that fueled Parisians and other starving French subjects to take to their own means of obtaining bread and other scarce staples. Break-ins, robberies, and fistfights turned Paris into a dangerous city, and it was clear that King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, residing some 13 miles away from Paris in the lavish Palace of Versailles, were aware of the issues in Paris, but seemed dismissive to the needs of the starving Parisians. It had been fairly common that Parisian publications distributed unflattering and accusatory images and articles regarding the king and queen. The anti-royal press campaign ridiculed Queen Marie Antoinette's nationality, competency, marital fidelity, and lavish Versailles lifestyle. It also published the infamous quote of "Let them eat cake" as the Queen's response to the issues of starvation in Paris. It was spun as a dismissive and condescending solution to the plight of her French subjects and enraged Parisians. Ultimately, King Louis XVI would call the Estates General to convention in late spring of 1789 in order to address the financial problems plaguing Paris and France at large. This seemed like a real opportunity for representatives of all three estates to come together and devise a plan to offset the financial crisis. However, King Louis was more interested in figuring out ways to increase taxes, which would in turn enable his state to spend money accordingly. Representatives of the Third Estate also wanted the convention to be a single and unified meeting of all three estates to address all of the grievances and potential solutions. However, that was not to be, as the king and the First and Second Estates deemed it too radical to do so. In effect, the representatives of the Third Estate were placed in their own convention hall at the Palace of Versailles, and rarely engaged in any discussions with the other two estates and Louis and his administration. In June of 1789, members of the Third Estate were actually locked out of their convention hall and were basically expected to accept their minimal to non-existent participation in the decisions of the Estates General. Rather than accepting their lack of participation, they moved to a nearby tennis pavilion in Versailles and made what was called the Tennis Court Oath on June 20th, 1789. In that oath, the representatives defined their body politic as the National Assembly and swore to continue to convene until a written set of rights for French men and a French constitution were drafted and presented to King Louis XVI. This inaugurated the first phase of the French Revolution. This first phase has been referred to as the moderate or liberal phase of the French Revolution. The phase was in direct response to the corruption and absolutism of the ancient regime and sought moderate change that would limit the monarch's power. Between 1789 and 1791, the French moderate phase commenced, and the National Assembly continued to convene in its endeavors to draft a set of rights and a new constitution. The moderate phase did not occur without some radical activity of the French populace. For example, on July 14, 1789, Parisians took to the streets and stormed the Bastille. The Bastille was a prison and weapons storage facility that represented the corruption and absolutism of the French monarchy. Parisians stormed the Bastille and released the prisoners, which was really just a handful of prisoners, and armed themselves with the weaponry of the French military that was stored in the Bastille's armory. Bastille Day became a rallying point for the Parisians and was the first action steps of fraternity of the marginalized peoples of Paris against a common enemy, the French monarchy. A month later, in August of 1789, the National Assembly drafted its set of rights called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. 2 months later, in October of 1789, amidst the continuation of bread shortages, high prices, and starvation, thousands of women participated in the March to Versailles, with demands that King Louis XVI supply them with wagons of bread. At the gates of Versailles, some of the women came unhinged and murdered some of the king's royal guards who confronted the group. Their heads went up on pikes and were marched through the courtyard. Eventually, the king agreed to meet with the leaders of the group and agreed to have wagons of bread escorted to Paris when they returned to the city. The women in the king's chamber, interestingly, also made one more request: that the king accept and adhere to the Declaration of the Rights of Man, a document that completely left women out as active citizens within a politically changing France, was carried to fruition by the French women who participated in the March to Versailles. 2 days later, Louis and Marie were forced to leave the Palace of Versailles and take up residence in the Tuileries Palace in Paris, where the National Assembly and the Parisian citizens could keep their eyes on them. Over the next 2 years, the National Assembly continued to make reforms to the absolute monarchy of France. The National Assembly organized a revolutionary army. It helped to increase popular participation, especially within Paris. It placed the French Roman Catholic clergy under state control, as it drafted the Constitution of the Clergy in 1790, which meant the Catholic clergymen were now directly ordered and compensated by the French state. This commanded the clergy, who was once a part of the First Estate, to pledge its loyalty to the new French government, the National Assembly. The National Assembly also took to confiscating the lands of the nobility, who remained strict royalists, and abolished hereditary privileges that the nobility traditionally enjoyed as members of the Second Estate. These actions caused a great flight of French nobles out of France to other places in Europe that would protect their titles and status. Speaking of flight, the royal family even attempted to flee from Paris to Varennes in June of 1791 in hopes to ultimately make it to Austria to seek protection and alliances with Marie's family, the Habsburg dynasty. The family was caught and arrested and returned to the Tuileries Palace and confined there on house arrest. 3 months later, King Louis XVI was forced to accept the French Constitution of 1791, which set up a unicameral legislature and made Louis a figurehead in France's first constitutional monarchy. Louis no longer had budgetary control and could no longer dismiss the legislature, and the National Assembly could have Louis deposed as king. Comparatively, Louis had fewer powers than the first president of the United States, thanks to the new French Constitution. Come 1792, the moderate phase of the French Revolution began to morph into a more extreme and radicalized phase. The financial crisis and bread shortages were not completely fixed. The National Assembly was also dealing with counter-revolutionary uprisings by nobles and devout French Roman Catholics who had been victimized by the moderate phase of the revolution. Although Louis and Marie never made it to Austria, anti-revolutionary sentiments were running high across Europe. It was almost as if France was in a fishbowl, and the monarchs and privileged nobility of other European states could see what was happening and knew they did not want revolutionary actions being taken against them in their own states. It was then that alliances began to form among European states in order to combat the intensifying French Revolution. It was for these reasons that the moderate phase morphed into a radical phase, and in September of 1792, just a year after the establishment of the French Constitution, the National Assembly was replaced by the National Convention, and France became a republic. King Louis, charged with treason, was executed via the guillotine in January of 1793. Whereas the moderate phase of the revolution sought to limit the power of the monarchy, the radical phase sought to abolish it. This action led directly to the building of the first coalition against France. The first coalition included Austria, Prussia, England, the Netherlands, and a host of other European states. Its goal was twofold: to prevent revolutionary activity from spilling into their respective states, and to defeat the radical French revolutionary government. The radicalized National Convention responded by conscripting a large French army, which sought to defend its revolutionary government, defeat coalition armies, and spread revolutionary activity to the underprivileged peoples of Europe. The National Convention organized a levée en masse, or mass levy or draft of a revolutionary army that consisted of some 650,000 soldiers. This inspired not only French revolutionary fervor, but also a sense of French nationalism in the face of great challenges from other European nations. At home, after the execution of Louis XVI, the National Convention began to divide along radical and moderate political lines. The Girondin, or moderate political party, saw the revolution as having gone too far and had put France in a vulnerable position in Europe. The Radical Party, La Montagne, or the Mountain, had a faction within its party known as the Jacobins, the most radical representatives of the new French Republic. Led by Maximilien Robespierre, the Jacobins responded to Girondin opposition by instituting the Reign of Terror. The Reign of Terror was characterized by the executions of French Girondin moderates within the Republic who were deemed counter-revolutionaries. Additionally, the Reign of Terror established a police state that led to the executions of thousands of Parisian citizens who were arrested and convicted of crimes of treason and counter-revolutionary activity. The weapon of choice by the Committee on Public Safety? The guillotine, an apparatus with a sharp blade that was dropped on the necks of counter-revolutionaries in a swift decapitation that, for its time, was deemed a more humane method of execution. Robespierre and his Jacobin radicals also fixed prices and wages to counteract the financial crisis. The radicals also took to a policy of de-Christianization. Whereas in the moderate phase, French clergymen were now employees of the French government, the radical phase saw the complete abolition of the practice of organized religion, including Catholicism, within France. Priests were exiled and in some cases executed. Mass was interrupted and church buildings were used for radicalized political propaganda activities, such as the Festival of Reason held at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris in 1793. The radical government also replaced the Gregorian calendar with a French Republican calendar, which had the months renamed to terms that captured France's weather and climate conditions. Women who had enthusiastically participated in the early phase of the revolution and only marginally experienced brief improvements in legal status, citizenship in the radical republic was quickly restricted to men. Olympe de Gouges, a French feminist and playwright, drafted a new set of rights based on the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, and titled it the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen in 1793. Her publication revised the original declaration to empower women as active citizens within the French Republic. Although she did gain some support from some small circles of revolutionaries within Paris, she was ultimately executed by the radicals for her writings that were deemed to be royalist sympathetic. Olympe de Gouges, another victim of the guillotine. Radicalism, as you can imagine, bred great animosity, and in 1794 the so-called Thermador reaction occurred, which was a movement within the French Republic to bring down the most ardent French radicals, including Robespierre, the architect of French radicalism. Robespierre and his Jacobin associates went on the run after it was announced that their arrest warrants had been issued. Detained in the Hôtel de Ville in Paris, having suffered a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the jaw that had been a failed suicide attempt, Robespierre was brought to justice, and he ultimately received the death penalty via the guillotine, the very device that was used to fulfill the thousands of death warrants that he and his Committee on Public Safety were responsible for during the radical phase. For the next 5 years, from 1794 until 1799, a more conservative and stabilizing French revolutionary government was established. Called the Directory, 5 militant directors and a legislative body with representatives who were voted by only land-owning males governed France. The Directory continued to wage war against coalition nations, such as Austria and England, but brought a time of post-terror stability at home in France. The Directory also undid a lot of the radical reforms made by the National Convention and instituted a new constitution, now France's third constitution in 5 years. Revolutionary idealism, especially from the radical phase, inspired activity outside of France and outside of Europe. A slave revolt led by Toussaint Louverture in the French colony of Saint-Dominique in the Caribbean Sea. Having started in 1791, the slave revolt grew in size and success during the radical phase of the revolution back in France. Although most people in France, especially land and business owners, still saw slaves as property and the role of government to protect their property rights, Some radicals within revolutionary France actually supported the abolition of slavery in the French Dominion. In fact, radicals of the French Republic abolished slavery in the French Dominion in 1794. This did not stop French plantation owners in Saint-Dominique from retaining their slaves and defending their property from Toussaint's slave revolt. Ultimately, Toussaint's slave revolt succeeded in two goals: liberating people of African descent from a brutal system of slavery and securing independence from France. The nation of Haiti became the second free state in the Western Hemisphere in the year 1804. While many were inspired by the revolution's emphasis on equality and human rights, others condemned its violence and disregard for traditional authority. One such English member of Parliament and political pundit was Edmund Burke. Going back to the American Revolution, Burke actually believed that American colonists were justified in their grievances to the English government regarding taxation without representation. In fact, he wrote in 1775 all about this. Quote, "Do not burden them, the American colonies, with taxes, but if intemperately, unwisely, fatally, you sophisticate and poison the very source of government by urging subtle deductions and consequences odious to those you govern, from the unlimited and illimitable nature of supreme sovereignty, you will teach them by these means to call that sovereignty itself in question. If that sovereignty and their freedom cannot be reconciled, which will they take? They will cast your sovereignty in your face. No body of men will be argued into slavery." Although Burke was not a supporter of the violence associated with the American Revolution, he did sympathize with the American colonists and their taxation woes under the English government, echoing a bit of John Locke. However, with the French Revolution and its propensity toward violence, Burke tended to echo a lot more of Thomas Hobbes, as in his 1790 piece that he wrote. Burke stated, "The state ought not to be considered as nothing better than a partnership agreement in a trade of pepper and coffee, to be taken up for a temporary interest and to be dissolved by the fancy of the parties. The state is a partnership, not only between those who are living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born." Ultimately, Burke condemned the violence of even the early French Revolution and the intensified violence of the radical phase of the French Revolution. Edmund Burke was a late 18th century political conservative who took issue with the radical and violent change in a political and social sense. His viewpoints would be shared with political leaders who sought to retain traditional political and social systems that had come under fire by revolutionary activity, and conservatism became a guiding political ideology and practice in the early 19th century in Europe. 1799 was the final year of the reign of the more conservative French Directory. Again, the Directory was born out of and completely dependent on the French Revolutionary Army. During the years of the radical phase and the years of the Directory, the French Revolutionary Army succeeded in campaigns against the English, the Austrians, and the Prussians, and other members of the First Coalition. Soldiers and officers gained rank quickly through the army's successes outside of France. One such officer was a man who had been born on the Mediterranean island of Corsica and had become a cadet in the French military academy at the age of 10. Graduating at the age of 16 and joining the French military, the years of the radical and conservative phases afforded him to gain in rank, and by the end of 1793, he was promoted to brigadier general at the age of 24. This officer became passionate about the revolution and the French nationalism that was engulfing the French nation. In 1799, he decided to take matters beyond his rank's responsibilities and organized a coup d'etat, or an overthrow of the French state, namely the French Directory. That man was Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1799, Napoleon established his new government, called the Consulate, and made himself first consul. He had a new constitution drafted that year, now France's fourth constitution in 8 years. Championing the republicanism of the radical phase of the French Revolution, Napoleon held a plebiscite in 1802 and successfully became consul for life. 2 years after that, in 1804, Napoleon took the title of emperor, and the French Napoleonic Empire was born. As the first consul and emperor, Napoleon undertook a number of enduring domestic reforms, including the appointment of officials, military officers, and other professional careers to be based on talent and merit, rather than on nepotism and tradition. He reorganized the French educational system and centralized the French bureaucracy. In 1801, he had issued the Concordat, an agreement with the Roman Catholic Church, to allow the churches to reopen, and allowed for protection of Catholic practices within France for the first time since 1793. His Concordat echoed the constitution of the clergy from 1790 during the moderate phase of the Revolution, as Napoleon made the French clergy employees of his French state. In 1804, Napoleon drafted his Civil Code, sometimes referred to as the Napoleonic Code, which commanded that all French citizens paid taxes and every Frenchman was equal under the law. In many ways, these reforms echoed a lot of the Enlightenment's idealism. However, Napoleon, as an emperor, often curtailed some French rights and manipulated popular impulses behind a facade of representative institutions. For example, the lives of women did not improve under the Napoleonic Code. They gained no divorce rights, property rights, or political rights during the entire Napoleonic period. Napoleon also reinstated slavery throughout the French Dominion while the Haitian slave revolt was still happening. When challenged, he silenced his critics with strict censorship as he curtailed freedoms of speech and press. He set up a secret police to crack down on dissent. Therefore, Napoleon's domestic policy showed him to be a dichotomous figure, as he tended to champion Enlightenment reforms but reeled them in to protect his own authority. So what do you think? Was Napoleon an absolutist, an enlightened despot, or truly a champion of Enlightenment idealism? Outside of France, Napoleon made Frenchmen and the rest of Europe believers in his military prowess. Napoleon utilized new military tactics that allowed him to exert direct and indirect control over much of the European continent. In some places in Europe, surrender to Napoleon meant a brutal French occupation. For example, in Spain, he ousted the Bourbon family from power. He sent the Portuguese royal family into exile to Brazil. He broke down the Holy Roman Empire and turned it into the German Confederation with his campaigns against Austria. He challenged the royal families of Prussia and Russia and made life extremely difficult under his occupation. In Europe, Napoleon's Grand Army helped to establish his Grand Empire. Napoleon's French empire building garnered nationalistic responses throughout Europe. For example, student protests against brutal French occupation occurred in Prussia. Spanish loyalists also rose up against Napoleon and Napoleon's brother, who was appointed the new monarch of Spain. Spanish freedom fighters enacted guerrilla warfare in attempts to ambush French soldiers and push France out of Spain. In Napoleon's Russian campaign, Russian soldiers and landowners abandoned their lands and destroyed their fertile agricultural lands in order to force Napoleon's army to forage in an attempt to halt Napoleon's advancements. Outside of Europe, Napoleon did not always get what he wanted. In 1802, Napoleon sent a large expedition of soldiers to Saint-Dominique to put down the slave revolt. Ultimately, most of those soldiers never returned to France. 2 years later, in 1804, Saint-Dominique became the newly independent nation of Haiti. In 1803, in order to raise revenue for his building of his Grand Empire in Europe, Napoleon decided to sell the Louisiana Territory to the United States, known as the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Territory had recently been regained by France in a treaty with Spain, but then sold by Napoleon to the U.S. under President Jefferson in 1803. Napoleon's Western Hemispheric interests were waning, as he lost territory in North America and the Caribbean. As well, not all of Napoleon's military actions within Europe were successful. For example, one of the biggest mistakes by Napoleon was his enactment of his continental system, his attempted naval blockade of England. The goal was to starve England into revolution and submission during the Napoleonic Wars by not allowing ships from Northern Europe and the Atlantic to enter into England's ports. Napoleon would have to depend on the nations that he occupied to oversee the continental system, and in many cases that did not stop English vessels or other commercial vessels from making it to English ports. Additionally, the English Navy was just so much more powerful than the French Navy, and as Napoleon concentrated his efforts on trying to defeat the English Navy, it actually hurt French commercial vessels, who were fired at by English naval vessels, and ultimately began to hurt the French economy. However, Napoleon's biggest military failure came with his Russian campaign in 1812. Bringing with him some 600,000 soldiers into Russia, Napoleon attempted to defeat the Romanov dynasty and bring Russia under his grand empire. As Russian soldiers retreated and enacted their scorched earth policy, it became extremely difficult for Napoleon's grand army to survive. As the campaign elongated and winter set in, some 500,000 of his 600,000 soldiers died. Napoleon's army never made it to Moscow, and he never even attempted to take St. Petersburg, Russia's political capital. Napoleon ultimately fled back to France with few of his soldiers with him. Coalition armies then invaded France, seized Paris, and Napoleon was exiled to the island of Elba in 1814. In 1815, Napoleon escaped Elba with a few hundred soldiers and landed in France and sought to reestablish his imperial rule over France. He was able to bring France under his control for 100 days in 1815. Rounding his 100 days was the coalition army's success against Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo in the Netherlands in June of 1815. Napoleon would surrender to England's commander, the Duke of Wellington, and accepted his second and final exile. This time, Napoleon was exiled to the island of St. Helena in the southern Atlantic Ocean. Napoleon would die in exile in 1821. Eventually, Napoleon's remains were brought to Paris, where they are entombed today. After the defeat of Napoleon, a coalition of European powers, known as the Congress of Vienna, attempted to restore the balance of power in Europe and contain the danger of revolutionary or nationalistic upheavals in the future. Leaders of the Congress of Vienna championed political conservatism as they sought to reinstate the families, leaders, privileges, and traditions of the political and social systems that had predated the French Revolution and had been ruined by Napoleon. The French Revolution and the ensuing Napoleonic period drastically altered France and Europe's political, social, and cultural systems. The agreements made by the Congress of Vienna had great consequences for the entire continent. Look back in history and consider the parallels between the changes brought about by the Congress of Vienna in 1815 and the decisions that were made at Westphalia in 1648. Look ahead in history and consider the parallels between the consequences of the decisions at Vienna in 1815 and the decisions that were made in 1919 at the Paris Peace Conference that produced the Treaty of Versailles. Consider why European historians see 1815 as an endpoint of one of the eras in modern European history and a starting point to another era in modern European history. What do you think the most significant consequences were of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic period?